So, cyberpunk. It's currently partway through its fifth decade of cultural relevance. What started in the 80s with early works like Neuromancer and Blade Runner quickly worked its way into the mainstream of science fiction with its cloying neon-clad predictions of the future. It's a seemingly endlessly malleable genre, able to be bent and twisted to explore things like capitalism, the role of machines and artificial intelligence in our lives, and the way we interface with technology more broadly. From this groundwork of cyberpunk as a cultural critique came the cyberpunk aesthetic. You know the one. Advertising everywhere, LCD screens, neon glows against endless city skyscrapers, metahumans with augmented body parts, plugging themselves into computers one way or another. It's an extremely cool look, and it's the dominant element of the genre that's wormed its way through a shifting cultural zeitgeist to be retained. If there's one thing the Cyberpunk 2077 game got right, it was the look and feel of Night City. A constantly drizzly, glowing streetscape replete with ugly bartenders and pretty girls seeking only to chew decks and do biz. This aesthetic now carries a cultural inertia all its own, and in some ways we've begun to bring it about in our cities. We now have real-life, screen-sized advertisements casting sickly glows over us. So much so that the overbearing nature of the ads shown in the original Blade Runner seem quaint in comparison. However, I think it also says something about us, and is yet another example of the kind of anxieties that this genre continues to tap into. What's more, while some of the more prescient themes of early cyberpunk now feel retro and outdated, I think that the city and the state of its inhabitants are perhaps more relevant now than they ever have been. I think that cyberpunk aesthetics and the virtual worlds that feature in cyberpunk works can be seen as a response to a kind of collective anxiety about the anonymization of self and our disconnection from culture. Both the removal of ourselves from space and the removal of space from our lives. I'm talking about the third space. There's been a lot of discussion about third spaces and the way that they've disappeared in the last few years. If you aren't familiar with the term, think of it like this. The first space is your home. The second space is your work. The third space is the place you spend the time in between. A place for spontaneity, connection, and a sort of unstructured nature to its mode of use. I think long before these spaces really began to decline, cyberpunk showed it happening through its aesthetic, and more specifically, its architecture. To demonstrate what I mean, I want to talk about what it is that I think the cyberpunk aesthetic is actually doing. It looks like nothing more than a big billboard plastered with neon at night in the rain in a city with Keanu Reeves in it, but I think there's a specific combination of ideas that when combined produce cyberpunk, and I think that the architectural depiction in cyberpunk is discussing something societal, a kind of next step in the way architecture defines us spatially. I want to look at these architectural ideas, their history, what they meant in the context of their time, and what they bring to the cyberpunk aesthetic. Once we understand how all these architectural elements and styles fit into one another and produce the cyberpunk aesthetic, we'll have a better understanding of a new way to understand what it's saying. All those parts reflect back on the way people interact with space, with each other, and with culture. We're going to explore the way architectural structure separated from its ornamentation, a process that took a long time, but once it happened, it paved the way for modernism and other contemporary forms of expression. Specifically, we're interested in Las Vegas and the particular way that it delineated its ornamentation. I'm going to talk about the way the city is built, the way architects try to contend with the physical bulk of skyscrapers and their imposition onto the public realm, and the way they obscure what's happening within despite the transparency of the glass facades, and they create a public realm that is hostile to anyone who isn't anonymous. This is directly referenced in some seminal cyberpunk works. When this is done, we'll understand what's happening to the city architecturally that has resulted in the demise of the third space. Then we're going to go back in time and examine a French art movement that created false realities and formed some of the foundational ideas for modern video graphics and computer games. I want to compare the way virtual spaces are depicted in cyberpunk and compare them to the virtual spaces in art, and then think about the way that screens particularly carry both all and none of the cultural weight of our world. The way that our impression of space has become our third space. When all said and done, I hope you'll understand that the world as depicted in cyberpunk reveals an anxiety about ourselves and about how we inhabit the world, the places we go to unwind, and how we've produced a disconnection from the cultural items and places that we should care about. All this is to say, welcome to Cyberpunk, Architecture, and the Third Space. I'm going to assume that if you clicked on this, you have at least a passing interest in cyberpunk, so I won't spend too long on definitions. However, I'm talking about the aesthetic specifically, and I think it's worth describing which works I'll be talking about specifically. Cyberpunk, at its core, is a postmodern take on science fiction. Technology is not the saviour of humanity. It is as much the boot as it is the feed line, providing us with just enough sustenance to survive. Positive examples of governance are nowhere to be seen, and states are, by and large, ineffectual, if not completely dissolved. Neoliberalism has been allowed to proceed to its natural endpoint, and markets are deregulated to the point of being openly hostile, if not deadly. In cyberpunk, crime doesn't just pay, it's the only thing that does. In a way, cyberpunk is a cynical response to a world that was rapidly deregulating its markets, and some writers and artists grasped the reality of the natural endpoint of a world run by technology and corporatism. In short, cyberpunk as a genre is probably the only thing you can thank Reagan for. For the sake of this piece of work, I'm going to be referencing some of the genre giants, touchstones from which I can expect people watching to at least heard of, even if they haven't seen or read them themselves. Aside from picking a few of the well-known examples of cyberpunk because they're well-known, I'm also picking them because what I'm talking about, the aesthetic, is codified and driven home extremely well by the progenitors of the genre. While many approaches to cyberpunk exist to explore different themes, the aesthetic is surprisingly monolithic. Seriously, it's weird to read Neuromancer in the year of our Lord current year and see just how much of the raw vibe has been captured in that book. As well as Neuromancer, Blade Runner will make an appearance. Other examples are things like Ghost in the Shell, Alita Battle Angel, and the Matrix films because they show the city in such an interesting way. For the second part, where we're talking about virtual spaces, I'll be referring to Neuromancer and the Matrix again, as well as Snow Crash. The depiction of the metaverse in Snow Crash is probably the most evocative description of the kind of spaces I'm talking about. And I'll be referring to all of these spaces as metaverses. When I use that term to refer to things in the real world, I'm not talking about Zuckerberg's failed pivot to VR, but I'm talking more figuratively. Websites, apps, video games, and other elements that occur on screen. Cyberpunk is an incredibly broad and compelling genre that I could just sit here all day and talk about, but there's already a great 3-part documentary on the history of the genre by Indigo Gaming that you can check out, link in the downstairs or whatever. The selections I've made have been picked because they showcase what I'm talking about in an interesting way, but they are by no means the only places in the genre where you can see these things. They are just an indicative handful that will allow me to talk about what I want to talk about. Now we know what cyberpunk is, we need to talk about one of the most important parts of architectural theory, structure and ornament, and to do that we need to go back a bit. This is a big subject which talks about things like tectonics and phenomenology and Latin words like firmitas, utilitas, and venustas. But basically, architectural form has a couple of underpinning principles that date back a long time, like prehistory long time. In essence, one of the things that was agreed upon for thousands and thousands of years was that architecture could not be, and was not, merely a structure. Architecture, in order to be architecture, had to imbue itself with both structure, that is, the means and material and manner in which it stays upright, and ornament, those things that aren't directly related to the structure, but which nevertheless bring that element of delight and meaning to the building. Probably the best example I can give for this is the classical orders of the columns. In ye olde times, doesn't matter when, if you were building a column and you wanted it to be capital A architecture, you wouldn't just stack a bunch of blocks on one another. That was for farmers and peasants. To make it beautiful, you would imbue the structure with the necessary ornamentation by understanding the proportions of the orders and how to best implement them in a given design. The ornament, while not a strictly necessary part of the design to make it stand up, was nevertheless combined with and part of the structure, and the architecture comes out of the implementation of both of these parts. For most of history, when we talk about architectural ornament, we were talking about this kind of attached, intractable part of the architectural design. Gothic cathedrals have grotesques and gargoyles, the Renaissance had its decorated pilasters and detailed vaults and pediments. All through history, if you were doing real architecture, you were embarking on the serious journey of structure and its ornamentation. Then came the Baroque and the Rococo. So if you look at Baroque architecture, a style popularized during and after the Renaissance, you can see that it's starting to play some games with the way that it was built. San Carlo alla Quattrofontana, that's in Rome, asks, why does this entablature have to be straight? And then has a waveform embedded in it. Why do we need to have columns outside when I can have a wall? Can I make this wall still look like columns? Who knows? What's structural here and what's ornamental? The entablature typically exists to hold the columns up, but if there aren't columns, does the structural element become entirely ornamental? Do the relief drawings that are part of the wall become structural if it's holding stuff up? I know that this looks like a stuffy old church, but Borromini was, and I'm not joking here, doing some weird Frank Gehry shit for his time. The questioning of whether structure ended and ornament began was a question that Baroque was asking in earnest. Towards the end of the Baroque period, something happened. That something was called the Rococo. This is the Rococo, and it rules. What the Rococo did, rather than trying to bend and warp the line between structure and ornament, was to draw a hard delineation between them. Where the Baroque coquettishly pointed at parts of the structure and went, but what if I kind of made it ornamental, perchance? The Rococo split the structure and ornament as though they were two halves of a piece of firewood. In separating the structure and the ornament, all your structural elements are doing the thing, holding up the building, throwing down with columns and pilasters and walls and whatnot. And then the ornamentation was an attachment, a separate thing that got applied to the building after the fact. The ornament, which for so long had been this intrinsic thing to the architectural design of the buildings, was suddenly this separate commodity that could be applied after the fact. This, in a way, paved the road for modernist architecture. By separating these two things out, the structure and the ornament, you end up with a structure that becomes an ornament on its own. In the best modern buildings, the structure itself is expressive in a way that it never was before. And that's how you get places like, for example, Farnsworth House, or Falling Water, or the Ville Sauvois. So you've probably been looking at this and thinking, what has this got to do with cyberpunk? Well, it's got to do with the way that Baroque and Rococo paved the way for the increasing separation of structure and ornament, and the way modernism encouraged the continuation of that separation. So, if we continue this idea of what the Rococo started, and modernism encouraged, of ornamentation being a separate and separable thing, the next step to take was about what to do with signs. A sign is a form of ornamentation, stuck onto the side of a building, illustrating in some way what it's about. In Las Vegas, businesses found that they weren't able to adequately advertise to people if their signs were just on the front of buildings, like this. After all, the majority of people visiting Vegas in the 60s and 70s did so by driving cars, not by walking past. As a result, Las Vegas began to organize its space around the road, pushing its ornament away from the buildings into bright signage on the street. As the place became more popular, bigger and brighter signs began to fight for space in the sky. Learning from Las Vegas talks about the fact that the architecture, that is, the buildings themselves, was kind of secondary to this brash, pop art commercial ornamentation that stuck out everywhere, screaming for attention along the strip.
The big sign leaps to connect the driver to the store, and down the road the cake mixes and detergents are advertised by their national manufacturers on enormous billboards inflected toward the highway. The graphic design and space has become the architecture of this landscape.
I mean, look at the image on the screen right now. You're looking at a series of buildings that are so obscured by signage that they're no longer really identifiable as buildings. The decoration, or ornamentation, has completely outgrown the shape and size of the structure it was supposed to be connected with. Now, look at this image of Vegas in the 1970s. Now look at these cyberpunk images. The leap between them is not very much, if you don't mind me saying. So the next obvious step for me to say is, well, if you think this cyberpunk is bad, well, how about this? And then flash to a photo of like, I don't know, Times Square or something, which, you know, I can do. There we go. Look at the way, yeah, Times Square, look at it, it's Times Square. And yes, I think that in general, the level of advertisements we now see dwarf even the level of advertising that was seen as obscenely overbearing in movies like Blade Runner. The image of the girl on the side of the building, or the oversized holograms of Joy in the sequel, flirting with Ryan Gosling in the second most iconic role of his career, seem kind of quaint compared to images like this. But the point I want to make about this is not quite as simple as, look at how much we live in a cyberpunk future. There is an element of truth to that, but I think that the more important thing is to look at what I've just talked about. The tendency for structure and ornamentation to separate over time. As time has gone on, we've started to almost deal with two different types of architectures. The architecture of the building, and then the architecture of the ornamentation. The graphic sign in space has become the architecture of the landscape. I think that in general, the thing we interface with, more than we interface with buildings as we walk around them from day to day, is the signage, or with advertising. When you look at these images of learning from Las Vegas and compare it to the images you see in Cyberpunk, you can see this represented starkly back in the way streets are overrun with advertisements and screens. However, there is one big difference between the way things are displayed in Cyberpunk compared to how they're displayed in Learning from Las Vegas. In Cyberpunk, the signs aren't always on billboards. A lot of the time, they're on screens. I'll talk about what I mean by that a bit later on, but keep it in mind, it's important. So we understand that what has happened to this ornament in architecture, and you can see the way that this is displayed in Cyberpunk. But what about the structure? For that, we need to look to Rem Koolhaas, a prolific contemporary architect, but I need to make a quick note on some of the language I'm going to use in the next bit. In the next section, I'm going to be talking about transparency, but I wanted to be clear about the way that I'm using the word. In common parlance, transparent means see-through, and that's a fairly reasonable use of the term. What I want to talk about, though, is what we mean when we say see-through. One of the essays that I enjoyed most when I studied architecture was Transparency, Literal and Phenomenal. When we talk about literal transparency, we're talking about a thing being see-through. You look out the window of your home and you can see the things that are happening outside because the glass is transparent. This is what we normally mean when we say transparent, and it's useful for understanding the qualities of a material. If a thing is transparent, we know that we can see things happening on the other side of it. Phenomenal transparency takes that idea and makes it broader. For something to be phenomenally transparent, it needs to imbue some element of its purpose into its being. I think a reasonable example is something like an open-air market in a plaza versus a shopping mall. Shopping malls, for most of the time they've existed, have been monolithic, inwardly facing buildings. If you were to look at one from the outside, having never seen one before, and assuming that it wasn't covered in signage indicating its purpose, how would you know what it is? They're almost universally an enormous car parking structure surrounding a concrete box. Think about the phenomenon of going to a market, which is what a mall really is. Now think about that concrete box. What about the phenomenon of seeing that building tells you what to expect from the activities you'll engage with inside? Now, compare that to, say, a farmer's market. We have this understanding of a stall and a series of goods and someone standing in front of it. There's an implication of what it is that it represents, and even without signs, you can see what it is that's being sold. Even from the outside of the market, if you can see the stalls and the arrangement of the setup, you can probably tell that it's a market. That's phenomenal transparency. I mention this now because we're about to talk about Rem Koolhaas and the phenomenon of bigness in architecture. And when I talk about a lack of transparency, I want you to think about the clarity of intent, not the clarity of the glass. They're two different things. If you're like me, you live in a city, but even if you don't, there's an element to what I'm about to discuss that applies increasingly to suburban and rural life as well. The problem is bigness. Bigness is one of the things that Cyberpunk deals with directly in its aesthetic, and has done so since its inception. You see it from the very first instances of the genre, like in Blade Runner. I barely even have to show the example. the skyscrapers, the iconic opening scene of a single eye watching the oil burning over Los Angeles, in the distant future of the year 2019. Ghost in the Shell and Alita also both show large, sprawling cities, and a lot of this harkens back to imagery of the Kowloon walled city that was demolished in the early 90s. The fact that everything is big and wild and uncontrolled is uncontested, but when I mean bigness, I'm talking about an architectural phenomenon that is as much sociological as it is physical. Rem Koolhaas discusses bigness in an essay called Bigness and the Problem of the Large in his book SML-XL, where he describes bigness as a condition fueled initially by the thoughtless energy of the purely quantitative. The idea is this: once you've got a building of a certain size, any single person loses their ability to control its holistic design thinking. The thing becomes too complex, with too many parts, part of such a large system that it can't be anything other than a collaborative effort, and even then, it can't be meaningfully controlled. Buildings aren't just a collection of walls and floors and windows. Modern buildings have air conditioning, electrical systems, hydraulics, air pressurization requirements, fire escapes and sprinklers, and engineered facades. A given building has simply got too much going on in it for one person to reasonably even learn about it, much less implement it carefully and thoughtfully. As a result, it becomes a project team, and as anyone who has worked on a group assignment knows, certain parts fall by the wayside. And that's not a criticism on architects or engineers or project managers or tradespeople or anyone. It's just a fact of the way that these projects end up working. Because there is no completely effective way to meaningfully hold together all the pieces of the whole, the complete and final building is in some way incomplete, in some way incoherent. Unfortunately, bigness is also just really big. The same scale that makes it impossible to turn into a coherent whole gives it an unprecedented power over the place it inhabits. The sheer size of it makes it hostile, and it becomes an irreconcilable thing on the landscape.
Together, bigness breaks. With scale, with architectural composition, with tradition, with transparency, with ethics, implying the final, most radical break. Bigness is no longer part of any urban tissue. It exists, at most it coexists. Its subtext is fuck context.
And I mean, think about it. If you've ever walked alongside a skyscraper, you'll know what this quote is talking about. There's a foyer inside which you need permission to enter, through one or two doors. The rest is either glass, concrete, or stone. A solid wall that blocks you from inhabiting the interior space of the building and forcing you onto the pavement. The pavement is just a line that directs you either this way or that, and in most cities it's only a few feet wide before you're on a road. In this way, despite there being a physical place for you to occupy at the ground level, it's being withheld from you. Instead, you're pushed onto the urban realm, the in-between spaces of the buildings. Unfortunately, bigness holds sway over you here as well. Bigness begets bigness, you see. And when you get a whole heap of these kind of enormous, uncontrolled, incoherent buildings together, what do you get?
If bigness transforms architecture, its accumulation generates a new kind of city. The exterior of the city is no longer a collective theatre where it happens. There is no collective it left. The street has become residue, organisational device, mere segment of the continuous metropolitan plane.
Koolhaas, here, and before its time, is describing the removal of the third space. When buildings are designed in such a way that parks, playgrounds, plazas, and other places that exist for communal gatherings disappear, you lose the theatre of the street. Eventually, you're left with only leftover spaces. Spaces lit by dim glowing signs or piled with trash. In Alita, they play ball in these, abandoned parts of the city. So here we are then. The mere existence of big buildings, and the accumulation thereof, represent a kind of outgrowth forcing their way into the city. A huge, uncontrolled, concentrated mass of built form, without a unifying feature within itself or between other instances of itself other than to declare that it exists. Cyberpunk aesthetic nails this. The buildings overwhelm the city. They're enormous and incontrovertible and wild and completely unable to be reckoned with on their own terms. Meanwhile, their imposition on the public realm has made the ground a constant hustle and bustle, a shifting maelstrom of differing intent. To quote one of the most famous lines of Neuromancer,
Night City was like a deranged experiment in social Darwinism designed by a bored researcher who kept one thumb permanently on the fast forward button. Stop hustling and you sank without a trace, but move a little too swiftly and you'd break the fragile surface tension of the black market. Either way, you were gone.
This idea is also captured in The Matrix, with the image of the woman in the red dress. In cyberpunk works, the street is a place of anonymity, and anonymity must be retained at all times. Between the billboards and advertisements, people scurry below, trying to mete out an existence between corridors, and to stick out is to make a mistake. To mark yourself is in danger. The woman in the red dress is not anonymous, and Neo, by simply acknowledging that, becomes endangered. In the real world, this is less immediately threatening. I, for one, have never had a gun held to my head because I noticed an attractive woman, but there is the need to not stand out. The goal of being in this strange in-between space where leisure space used to occur is to be invisible. Move too swiftly, and you break the surface tension. However, a less obvious piece of this equation is that bigness itself reveals nothing of itself. We look at these buildings full of glass and concrete and steel, but we don't see what goes on inside. They are literally, but not phenomenally, transparent. Even within a big building, it's impossible to know what is happening between floors from one place to another. If you're in a skyscraper at the ground level, you are literally disconnected from everything else going on in the building. To get from one place to another, you have to take an elevator. And in all likelihood, even watching the people walk past you will give you no clue as to what they do for work. They, like the spaces around them, have been rendered phenomenally opaque. This is one of the core tenets that Koolhaas lays out in his retroactive manifesto, Delirious New York, and the fundamental fact that a building can be so disconnected from its purpose as to have completely different uses in different levels is something unique to skyscrapers, and to bigness, and you see throughout cyberpunk. Buildings, from skyscraper to pyramid, are depicted as these dark places, like a forest. In principle, our protagonists can and do go into them, but to the viewer, they're enigmatic. We have no idea what's happening in the pyramid in Blade Runner, nor why it has to be so big. The skyscrapers form a background that the spinners drive through, but we never see anything but the external building. They form a huge imposition on the space, but they don't interact with it. They, like the street, are rendered anonymous through their lack of transparency. What we are left with is a depiction of a world where work life is obscured behind the facades of buildings whose meanings we can't divine, and a street where there is no room remaining for the activities we normally see in a third space. People are reduced to scurrying through it from one place to another, and even this space is often shown as becoming yet another place for commercial activities, black markets, food stalls, and illegal sales. So what happens to the third space? The next piece of architectural language I want to explore is more about the way the mind conceptualizes space and how it's represented in cyberpunk. So let's talk about trompe-l'oeil. Trompe-l'oeil is a visual effect, one you've almost certainly seen before. You know those pictures you see of the pavement art where it looks like there's a hole in the ground? That's trompe-l'oeil. Its literal translation is to deceive the eye. It's a really fun trick and it's useful for all sorts of stuff. If you've ever tried painting non-metallic metal on a 3D object, that's a pretty niche reference for my Warhammer fans in the audience, you're using this effect. Even advertisements on the ground in football games use trompe-l'oeil these days, so they appear flat on the ground when the camera is looking at them. If you see them in real life, they're stretched out awkwardly when you stand next to them. In architecture, trompe-l'oeil enjoyed a brief moment of being fashionable in the mid-Renaissance. There are a heap of examples you can point to, but there are two that I think are particularly interesting for this discussion: the Château de Tanlay and Palazzo Spada. Château de Tanlay is an estate in Burgundy built in the 16th and 17th centuries. On the outside, it's the kind of thing you'd expect from a chateau. Big grounds, opulent, definitely not indicative of untold years of labour extracted from an unthanked peasantry. But inside there's the trompe-l'oeil gallery. In it you can see finely crafted stucco roofing, ornately carved wall reveals, and an absolutely wonderful collection of handcrafted marble statues, all recessed into the marble of the... Hold on. Look closer. Hopefully you can see what I'm talking about. This 21 metre long gallery doesn't have handcrafted stucco or finely detailed wall reveals or handcrafted marble statues. The walls are flat, and the effect is painted on. This chateau, rather than building the detail into the room itself, decided to build an illusion of depth into it. You can't walk up next to the sculptures, you can't stand behind them or exist next to them. This is true of paintings as well, and highly realistic portraits also exist in this era, but I think in this instance, where the art is specifically designed to look like architecture is a good early example of the kind of false reality that metaverses are trying to achieve, and the problems that you have when you try to bring the fiction into the real world. It looks real, it's very convincing, but it is an illusion. This space, and the way you interact with it, exists only in your mind. While this isn't a problem in fiction, it's something that reality has to contend with, which is why the internet, our own virtual space, has a lot of shortcuts. Another example of the trick of the eye being used in architecture is the Palazzo Spada. Built around the same time as the chateau, it features a trompe-l'oeil feature, this time centered around a colonnade that leads to a secret garden. Looking at the image here, it looks as though it's a long passage heading to a small step in a garden at the back. But again, it's a trick. The colonnade is only 8 meters long, and the architecture of the building is warped to accommodate the apparent scale of the ornamentation. The floor ramps up, the ceiling tilts down, and the relative size and distance of the columns shrink as you head towards the back of the room. It's precisely the trick from that Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory movie.
What is this, Wonka?
Gotta go forwards to go back. Better press on.
Hey, the room is getting smaller. No, it's not. He's getting bigger.
This instance of trompe-l'oeil is fascinating to me because in a sense it is real. You can do as the poor souls did in Willy Wonka and physically enter this space. Unlike the gallery in the chateau, this space is real. It's an actual place. When you touch a column, you can tell it's round, and from within it, the trick is revealed as you either bend down or bump your head to reach the tiny aperture and statue on the other side. This is a far better description of the way the physically contiguous metaverses of Neuromancer and Snow Crash operate. They are real and they are occupiable, but there are things that give them away, like the way you can spend time in the Palazzo Spada's false hallway. It's real, but not quite right. The street in Stevenson's metaverse has no collision. You can walk straight through people, and it doesn't pretend to be realistic. People of lesser means are only able to appear in staticky black and white, and character avatars are able to be defined by the users. It's only in the places of higher prestige that the unreality is twisted in such a way that it in some way enhances user experience. In Neuromancer, data appears as physical pathways, and Gibson's matrix stretches out information in physical form, not dissimilar to the streets and buildings of our real world. Its reality is a simulation, and the appearance of space is to assist with the navigation of the human within it.
Cyberspace, a consensual hallucination experienced daily by billions of legitimate operators in every nation, by children being taught mathematical concepts. A graphic representation of data abstracted from the banks of every computer in the human system. Unthinkable complexity. Lines of light ranged in the non-space of the mind, clusters and constellations of data. The unfolding of his distanceless home, his country, transparent 3D chessboard extending to infinity. Inner eye opening to the stepped scarlet pyramid of the Eastern Seaboard Fission Authority, burning beyond the green cubes of Mitsubishi Bank of America, and high and very far away he saw the spiraling arms of military systems forever beyond his reach. And somewhere he was laughing, in a white-painted loft, distant fingers caressing the deck, tears of release streaking his face.
In The Matrix, the Wachowskis' 1999 film, there's an interesting inversion on the way the virtual world works, in that, spoilers, the world that everyone inhabits is the virtual world. In this case, the real world becomes the place for the chosen ones, literally in the case of Neo, to inhabit. So there's this inversion where the real world is the metaverse that exists outside the Matrix. In a more specific sense though, the Matrix is still a place that is only made for the few and for the chosen, those being the machines and the sentient entities that run the place. So in these examples, you can see the way that virtual worlds, both in their early instances in architecture and their descriptions in cyberpunk media, are places of promise and an addendum to reality. A place where you can go and live a life of luxury, a place of relaxation, somewhere better than your humdrum reality of work and sleep. These are third spaces. Now I want to think about the way we use computers, and specifically, screens. A lot of the way that we think about computers, and the internet more broadly, is as space. A lot of the things described in the previous section are the same methods and means that computer graphics use to create the illusion of depth, and the idea of occupation. Trompe-l'oeil is a particularly powerful effect, as the trigonometry and careful perspectival tricks use the same mathematics that a graphics card uses to render 3D video games. It's all an abstraction of space, and humans are very good at finding their way around in space. We inhabit chat rooms, Discord servers, comment sections, even websites are described as though there's something that's inhabited. But, and I hope I'm not being controversial when I say this, they aren't. We can no more physically inhabit a chat room than we can actually walk around in an MMORPG. Dan Olson of Folding Ideas talks about this in his video about Decentraland. Everything is a compromise, a series of restrictions that reduce and control the means of expression that we have in a space. When I say that, I don't mean it as a, they're controlling our means of expression. I simply mean that our ability to express is incomplete in virtual worlds. You can't jump in Doom. You can't hug a friend over video chat. It's difficult to express sarcasm via text. Facial expressions are slightly uncanny. It's all slightly wrong and it's slightly unreal. And all this reduced expression is done through an interstitial layer. These days, this is usually a screen, be it a laptop or a phone or a desktop computer, interactive display or a billboard, but this extends to virtual reality headsets as well. And it even goes back to like a keyboard and mouse. It's all just an interstitial layer. Ultimately, there is you, there is the interstitial layer, and then there is the trick of the eye, the virtualization of the third space. This is the difference between the images we see of Cyberpunk and the images of Las Vegas. Where Las Vegas has its structure obscured by ornament, the signage that is fighting for its space and the attention of the cars driving down the strip, the imagery of Cyberpunk is one step removed from that. With Cyberpunk, it's almost as if there are two layers of structure. There's the building, and there's the sign, but the sign itself is blank. There's nothing on the sign if there's no electricity, and so the actual ornamentation is not extant. It exists somewhere else. For the sake of this discussion, I'm going to refer to the screen, both as it's depicted in Cyberpunk and as we use them in the real world, as a membrane. There's an old internet meme showing a bunch of different items with the caption, "All of these now fit in your pocket." It's referring to the fact that mobile phones, once a simple device made to communicate via voice, is now a music player, video camera, messenger device, all sorts of things. In this way, the artifacts of culture are now largely virtual, and the physicality of real space has been crowded out. In the contemporary world, we don't have items to perform specific tasks. We have electronic membranes that allow us to access through the interstitial layer to the kind of functionality we desire. On the small scale, we're talking things like messenger apps and things like that, but larger and more important parts of our lives are being pushed out of and away from the real world and now exist in the virtual spaces behind the membranes. The internet as we use it today is often as a third space. People hang out on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram in a manner similar to the way people used to hang out at the park. We use phones and websites for dating, for organizing meetups, to define our business dealings, to share images and support creators, and for all kinds of entertainment and users that, until not so long ago, required separate, discrete devices. Virtual worlds like Fortnite and Minecraft provide spaces for hangouts, and if for some reason that gets cut off, through the loss of electricity or loss of membership, or if something as simple as forgetting your password, then the third space and all of the social connections associated with it disappear. I think that the reason Cyberpunk has been as pervasive and as long-lasting as it is we have developed this deep unease at where we stand with the ornamentation in the world and what it means. I think that Cyberpunk is showing us, through its lurid imagery, a world where even the signs have been surrendered to the space behind membranes. It's showing us a world where ornament has continued to delaminate itself, first from structure and then from reality itself into the virtual world. Let's recap on where we've come from. I was interested in the way that Cyberpunk, despite being something created in an era of completely different social and economic circumstances, has tapped into something meaningful with its depiction of postmodern reality that go deeper than just its aesthetic. This has allowed the aesthetic of cyberpunk to far outlive the zeitgeist it was created in. I showed that the depiction of buildings and space in cyberpunk tap into the long and storied history of structure and ornament in architecture. The way that the Baroque began to play with what was structure and what wasn't, and the way that the Rococo just pulled the two elements apart. In doing so, the Rococo paved the way for modernism, where ornamentation could become what it became in 1970s Las Vegas. Enormous signs that dwarf and diminish the buildings themselves and take over the night. That history is shown so clearly in cyberpunk imagery, but it is augmented with the introduction of screens, membranes that create a virtual world where the ornamentation now exists. That ornamentation, despite its unreality, obscures the way the buildings have begun to take up space. The buildings themselves, both in cyberpunk and in modern cities, have fallen prey to the curse of bigness. They squat over land and take up space without revealing anything of what's going on inside. They both dominate and remove the public realm and create spaces that even from within are utterly opaque as to their use. In this way, the third space has been squeezed out of the public realm. This is obvious in examples of cyberpunk media with its depictions of the anonymous street and the soulless corpo, but it is just as prevalent in real life, as increasingly our lives are pushed behind the membrane that cyberpunk depicts in its screens and advertisements. So we're left with a series of interactions with the virtual, and cyberpunk delivers that in spades. A lot of our lives are reduced to interfacing with a membrane which holds an unreal amount of power for our ability to access the ever so important third space that our buildings have driven from us. We hang out with friends online, we date, we chat, we play games and esports and shop and swap and learn skills, all in spaces defined by their unreality. And we know it isn't real. It's something I think we intrinsically worry about as our lived-in world has become less and less of our own place of leisure, becomes more dominated by work and sleep and little else. In the core of its aesthetic, prevalent immediately and from its earliest examples, cyberpunk has leveraged architectural language to show us a world where there is no space for us, and where the core, most important parts of our humanity are hidden behind another layer of architectural delamination. Structure exists as an edifice keeping us away, and ornament is virtual, displayed as it were through tricks of the eye and unreality. We aren't there yet, but I think that we rightfully have anxiety about the way that these worlds continue to show us where our future is going. We may end up with a world entirely made of unrealities, where our community, connection, love, recreation, all the things we once did in the third space have been moved behind the membrane of the screens that cyberpunk plasters all over the world. We might become a culture without artifacts, a culture where the material idea of your own identity is lit up from a screen as though it were a billboard on a Las Vegas shed, a place where we're anonymous or we're virtual, and our virtual selves become our real selves, the real truth, and reality is simply where we eke out our existence. The third space is important, and it's important to retain it, because cyberpunk is, after all, a dystopia. We don't want to live in a world where our identity is bound up in virtual reality, limiting the range and breadth of expression that we have simply because we have to interface through a membrane. Because, like the gigantic billboards, it isn't impossible that the power goes out, that we lose our passwords, that the companies that provide us with connection and community mutate into something that we no longer recognize and can no longer use, and we are left alone and anonymous in a city and world that has become too large to fathom. G'day, you made it all the way. Thanks for watching. If I can't believe you've made it, thank you so much. If you liked this, feel free to do all the normal stuff, leave a comment, subscribe, all that sort of stuff. I've got some ideas for other videos in the future, other stuff that's related to social context and architecture and that sort of thing. So yeah, sign up for that if you want. I've also got a bunch of other stuff that I've done, which is available on my website. The link is in the description below. I've got a couple of books and some other stuff that I've written. If you really like this, I do have a Ko-Fi link, so you can send me a donation if you think it's worth it. If you don't think it's worth it, absolutely don't. Or if you can't afford it, absolutely don't worry about it. But yeah, once again, thanks very much for watching, and yeah, thanks for sticking around. Okay, bye.